And here we are again. All right. So for today's meeting, given the huge amount of emails I got on the mailing list, I've set up a small agenda together. We probably won't go through all the 4 items that I have on here, but probably the last one will give the heads up for some future meeting. So the stuff that we would like to discuss this week is this whole RuntimeConfig concept, which was introduced by making the capacity constraint be configurable, runtime modifiable is what I mean.
Right.
The another thing we probably want to discuss is what do we do with regards to disk store. So the disk, we have the open source 2x disk store ported. I spent quite some time on the plane back from somewhere looking a bit into it. There is a huge amount of work to go into it in order to make it clean. But it also has the issue that it keeps all the keys on heap. And since we've open sourced off heap, this would be a problem.
Yep.
If you have a 3-tiered system, then your problem's got to be your disk tier, which is the lowest one. So the authority, according to the Montreal design, which is kind of not very
Alex
sensible.
has just had the entire discussion.
No, I'm not. Yeah, well, maybe.
Pretty much.
And then I would like to discuss the content of milestone 2. Which relates to the point prior to that. One thing that I would like not to see in milestone 2 personally is the ARC stuff. And so if we have time left, we can discuss some of that. If we don't, it's probably something that we want to discuss very soon, most probably next week, if worst case the week after that. But yeah, anyways, makes for quite some interesting stuff. So let's start with the RuntimeConfig stuff. So let me quickly reintroduce this because it was all my stupid idea that I just managed to delegate to others, Reshab here being the poor guy working on all this. So there was, on the runtime configuration, there is this method that's marked as to be implemented somewhere, which is called set capacity constraint, right? And that takes a comparable long constraint. Right? So there are a couple of issues with that method. The very first one being that what is it really constraining the thing to, right? So you could argue that it constrains the lowest tier because that's the one that contains it all. So when you constrain that tier, you sort of constrain the entire cache to some extent. But possibly you're wasting resources in the case of off-heap, even though off-heap currently is not resizable. Or you're putting a system together that's going to behave very bad. If you have a huge on-heap store sitting above your disk store, this is, right, if you have the inverse pyramid kind of thing, this is not going to perform well. So it's one way of shooting yourself in the foot. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, so what should happen when you change this property? Well, this property, a property like this one. So looking at this, so obviously you could pass a mutable comparable long in there, right? That all the people that care about it would keep a reference to, and so if it mutates, guess what? They would see it. But my point is, if we do it this way, we need to repeat this pattern for every possible attribute that's runtime mutable.
More to the point, they would see it if they're looking.
Yes, but let's keep this as an aside.
Okay.
So you could. Well, I know what you're referring to. In the case of the capacity constraint, we always said that's the way we want it to behave. So except if somebody decides that's not the way we want it to behave anymore, we can discuss this. We always said that the way that we would split the overhead, and that's the way it always worked in prior Ehcache, is if you resize things, the to be smaller, obviously. If you make it bigger, there isn't really any cost to pay. But if you make it small, like say you move from 4,000 elements on heap to 2,000 elements on heap, right? The way that your cache will shrink is based on the access patterns to the cache. And the overhead of shrinking the resource usage will be paid by every thread doing a mutative operation on the cache. That's the way that it behaves today.
Right.
And honestly,
No,
I think it's a very sensible thing to do still. So I'm still on that.
What? Okay. I haven't very closely followed the discussion that you and Rashad have had.
It's not related to that, but
Okay. Or any of the discussion. I don't know if to say this or not.
I don't know. What is
I'll
this
say it, and then if you think it's irrelevant and stupid, just tell me it's irrelevant and stupid, and we'll carry on. It feels like if something is dynamic, if a property is dynamic and it can potentially be mutated by the user at any point, that you shouldn't be allowed to just do get foo, because that encourages you to not look, or it allows you to not look. It seems like maybe you should only be allowed to get foo by saying, or either that you're only allowed to get foo if you pass to the method get foo takes some kind of listener object, and then if you want the listener object you pass in to be null, fine, explicitly pass null, or maybe we'll log the fact that so-and-so retrieved a dynamic property but didn't register a listener.
Right. Okay. You're jumping ahead.
Okay, that's why
I think what you're saying is relevant. What you're asking for is further interface segregation, which we could do, i.e.
Right.
There would be a runtime config that's exposed to a user, and there would be an internal runtime config that's used by the internal thing, even though it's probably going to be the same concrete type implementing the both. Because the getter, you want it, because that's the way that the user can actually query what the current runtime config is.
Right.
So you want the simple getter. But anyways, you're jumping ahead.
Sure.
Possibly. But it's somewhat relevant. So what I'm thinking about instead. So think about the listener stuff. So if we create a mutable comparable T, right? You need to have this type do like all the listener stuff. Be the thing that contains the setter and the getter to the actual value, or lets you get to the value and lets you mutate it, and all of a sudden you have to repeat this for all the types. If you include the listener thing, as you said, you need to replicate that all over the place too. So my point is, I think that should be the runtime config. And I made the parallel with at least how I always coded GUIs. When they have such a runtime config thing that you control through a pane or whatnot, it actually mutates something in the back that contains the state of your config that other things can query as they need to, or again register listeners on in order to get notified when the value changes if they need to proactively register that. So long story short, what I'm saying, I think that should be the runtime config concern. So let me pause there for a sec and ask if this all sounds sensible to you guys. So if I recap all this, what I'm arguing for is when you create a cache, before creating the cache, you create the runtime config that represents what is the config that maps to the actual config that was passed in. You inject this runtime config into all the participants, or you provide it to all the participants, right? But ideally, in the case of the constraint, if I don't introduce the whole resource pool concept and whatnot, right? Which is probably the way that this should all work, but nobody effectively gets the thing and copies it locally, which refers to what Chris just said. You don't want to do a copy of the long that you always want to keep a pointer to the thing that contains the config that you care about. And what I'm talking about is I think that should be the runtime config.
Makes sense, I agree.
If we want to do further interface segregation, we can, right? When I say runtime config, what I really mean is the actual implementation of that, to be honest. Not the runtime config, the actual interface that's exposed to a public API. You're muted, Chris, so I see your lips move, but I could read on your lips.
Right.
Oh, you said right? Okay. The second time.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the way that I would do it. Now, if we say that we want to have an internal runtime config interface and maybe smaller bits, like I'm not really sure how the runtime config possibly would evolve to. It could be that it becomes a composition of multiple things, or not. And maybe certain bits of the config shouldn't necessarily depend on the entire config. So we could have our runtime config implement runtime config, internal runtime config, comma, like maybe, I don't know, example given, don't get hung up on it, like store config, listener config, blah, 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 so that it exposes whatever subsystem really needs, but becomes this one central place for all of that, because that's, from a user perspective, I think it's all going to be a single entry point. All right, so nobody jumping to the roof. So we have agreement on that sounding like a good plan until now?
I think so.
I have just one question. Why is the cache runtime configuration interface in the API?
Because that's what I said. The runtime config lets the user see what the runtime config of a thing is, including the setters to the mutable properties. Does that make sense? So it's I think it does it extend cache config or not?
Yes, it does.
Right. For all because that only has getters, right? And runtime config probably adds all the setters on it. That represents the stuff that you can mutate on a cache that's currently running.
Okay, so that's about allowing the user to
mutate
dynamically modify the stuff using the API. Okay.
This is why I said that maybe we want an internal runtime configuration interface that exposes that is how each cache internally interacts with it. So that we don't have to. So, for instance, if we want to solve the problem that Chris mentioned, that the getter always forces you to pass in a listener because we really want to focus on making sure that people don't copy this thing, making it very obvious. Then that would be on that interface, which wouldn't extend runtime config in that case, right?
From my point of view, I don't want to send this. I think that approach is good for two reasons. One is I think the vast majority of people that do this are probably going to want a push model for the changes because it allows you to do things more efficiently.
Right.
It allows you to do. It allows you
to. Honestly, what I agree with you, right? So for a bunch of things. So again, that particular example we're talking about aside, most probably you want to register listeners and whatnot. Yeah. I would have that on the runtime internal runtime config.
Yes, on the internal config. Yes.
Let me. I think I would have the internal runtime config extend the runtime config with all the listener stuff, and I would just trust engineers to use the proper mechanism that they need to use. So either keep a reference to the runtime config and go to it when you need to, or register a listener so that we're calling you whenever you need to know that.
To me, it just I don't trust them. I don't trust people to do the right thing. It's too easy to not do the right thing. What I would be tempted to provide is if somebody wants to do a poll model, right? Because they've decided that polling is what they want for whatever reason, then I think the most sensible thing to do is to provide that the internal runtime config interface gives you signatures where you pass a listener and it returns the value. And if you want to do polling, you pass null every time. But you have to explicitly pass null every time. So it's explicit call out that you've decided to do a polling model. Fine, use a polling model, we'll support you, but I want you to have to pass null every time to explicitly say, not that I'm an idiot and I didn't realize this is dynamic. It's very obvious it's dynamic. You're having to pass a null listener. Or maybe even have a special one called it can't pass null. You have to pass a magic.
So you do that.
I'm a polling thing.
But so you do that for all the things, even the ones that are not dynamic?
No. If it's not dynamic, then fine. You just call get. But if it's dynamic, you must pass something. Either you pass a listener or you pass some special listener instance that is the one that says, I'm going to poll. And then at that point, if somebody is passing in that I'm going to poll and then doesn't, well, fine. gave them the gun with the safety on, they took the safety off and shot themselves. That's their business. But I don't trust people, because it's too easy for somebody to, like, particularly if you think like somebody goes and writes their own store implementation. I mean, if they want it to not be dynamic, then fine. But then what they do is they pass the listener that when you try and fire on it, throws an exception back and says, "I don't support this thing by dynamic," and that will get propagated all the way up to the user and said, "This store that you've chosen to use, it says you can't change this value. Sorry, so this ceases to be dynamic now." But I don't. I think that it's. I think that the listener.
Right.
Oops.
This is actually a feature with Chris, right? Because at some point you can interject and say something.
I find Chris' ID a bit complicated.
A bit extreme, yeah. I'm like, I think it's gonna get us more. The good news is that we're the main consumers of that, so So what's your take, Rishabh, since you're working on that?
Yeah, so basically there'll be one thing that is quite obvious. We'll have to rename, I guess, the runtime config if it is present even before the initialization takes place. Secondly, I think like we talked earlier, if there's
Wait a
if
sec,
there
I
are
don't
changes
agree with
involved,
that. We need to rename it before the initialization takes place. You know, it's kind of leaking this from a constructor. It's the same thing. So it still remains a runtime config. The one additional caveat is that you construct it prior, and then you inject in everything, and this runtime config should not have a leak if the initialization fails. I understand it's a bit more complex than leaking this from a constructor, but it's the same kind of problems, right? Is like you need to make sure that you construct this thing properly, everything properly, and not let stuff leak all over the place. But yeah, that's. But there is the additional. Yeah. Anyways, so I think both. I'm not sure what. So what do you think on Chris's proposal, though?
Yeah, makes sense. That does make sense. But like when I started isolating the runtime config, like I mentioned it before, it's causing a lot of restructuring. Like a lot of the things have to be moved out of Ehcache or Ehcache manager and they instead have to be exposed. So this is something we'll have to take into account. Like, are we planning on doing that?
Well, need to be exposed. That's not necessarily true, right? The thing is that we had like inner classes that weren't static and were private. We can go discussing what we think about that, but I won't open that can of worm. But that's the stuff that needs addressing, right? Because that's what Rishabh means when he says these are things that we need to expose. They don't need to become public necessarily for
but they'll move out of the.
Yeah, they'll move out of this Java class, well, .java file. Let me put it this way, right? And then, but yeah, even when you argue about the bytecode, it's not even in the same class file. So, yeah. So Ludovic and I think that your idea, Chris, is a little bit over the top.
Cool.
Just like standardizing the tea recipe, you know, a bit over the top.
Cool. So what's the top? Where do we stop? Or is it all over the top and we go back to saying?
I think we should first trust the developers to do the right thing by calling the getters at the right time.
Should we have a callback, a push model available?
Yeah, we will have to. We will have to. Okay. So I think what I'm arguing for is we need to keep the run. So now I'm going to talk in purely, I hope, type system as it stands today. So I think we want to keep the runtime config as it is. we want so that's an interface that extends cache configuration. We want to have a internal cache config, a runtime config, sorry, that's not part of the API. Hopefully that works. I think it should. Maybe it's going to be a problem. I don't know. We'll see. But if it fits in the API module, it should be in a SPI or, well, not in an SPI, no. Well, it shouldn't be that too public. All right, bye, Chris. I think he was really disappointed we didn't agree with him. He's that kind of guy.
He left in disgust.
Yeah. So that's what you think about my ideas. I'm gone. So we should have an internal runtime config, right? Interface. Oh no, he's not that pissed. He came back.
Don't. This is something really weird. For reasons that I will not explain right now, I decided that I would, while you were talking, disable style sheets across the whole browser. That somehow stops. It doesn't just like disable style. It also stopped the audio and video from working, even when I switched style sheets back on again. I've now refreshed it, and the audio and video is working, but none of the text appears anywhere on the page. All the other pages that are open in the browser are fine.
I don't know.
But what on earth is it doing with style? Anyway, sorry.
Email Google.
Yes.
So have an internal config interface, right? That exposes the stuff that internally people will use, and that will, for instance, add the logic for registering listeners, event listeners on property changes.
Okay.
Okay. Then I would have a concrete implementation of that, right? That effectively takes care of all of the above.
Okay.
I think by default it should fire event for everything, and it should let you query and set everything.
Okay. The one.
Yeah. Anyways, yeah.
Just the one thing I will say, I will try and defend my insanity one more time.
Sure.
Try and argue for it again. Not because I necessarily think it's a good idea, but just because I had it, so I want to defend it a little bit and just see if
that makes sense. That makes sense. It's only fair.
So, the one advantage that what I suggested, one of the advantages that what I suggested had is you have one method on the internal interface that gets seen by the user, by the implementer of things. You have one method per property.
Right.
You're going to need multiple. You're going to need at least two, right? Because you're going to have you're going to separate listener registration from.
No, I would do exactly what I said. Maybe that wasn't really.
Sorry, maybe it wasn't clear, or maybe I wasn't concentrating.
What I said is you add a listener for property changes.
Oh, and you can decide which properties you're interested in.
Yeah.
And you
listen for what you care about, but you'll be told about everything.
Okay, we can do that.
No, it's not a big deal.
Okay.
So that's what I'm proposing. But that leads to the problem that Rishab talked about, because right now the runtime config is kind of a weirdo dude. And sadly enough, this leaks back into like event stuff too. So events is one that I would like to touch upon because something goes on that totally escapes me and puzzles me. So let me find this. So I got this private in a class, non-static, that's runtime config. And that actually uses some references of the cache instance, such as the store, and it's all around services actually, I realize, and the event notification service.
All right.
And so that really, really, really confuses me. So to begin with, I see like the event notification service that says if we don't have any event if we don't have listeners anymore,
right,
we disable the store event notifications. But the store event notifications, if my memory serves, they're only about eviction and expiry. Is this correct, or am I wrong?
I don't know. It's entirely that stuff from what I go.
It's not really important, actually. What I'm saying is that concern, responsibility leaks a little bit all over the place. There is this even notification service, right? Very interestingly, this guy himself is again using this instance because it's in our class again.
Right.
Of the Ehcache it was built upon to read properties of that. But the thing that builds it always builds, obviously, since it's in a class, a one-to-one mapping to the other type. Right?
Right.
Then that uses the store internally. That's a reference of the Ehcache that's inside the other thing. So anyway, it's a bit of a mess.
Yeah, it feels like the optimization to not call the listeners can happen. There's two places that can happen, and there's probably two optimizations, but.
Well, my take is it should be the responsibility of one guy. Probably the event. Crap, I scrolled.
Not necessarily, because there's two performance optimizations there, right? Potentially, if you're going to really micro stuff, it's worth checking to see if the list of listeners is empty before you do the iteration, because to do the iteration you have to create an object. To check if it's empty, you don't. Assuming you're doing a for each over a collection.
Right, I understand that, but I'm really.
But there is a separate reason to not fire, and that's something that only the store knows about. Which is that if the store knows it doesn't have to fire, if say you're the off-heap store and you know you don't have to fire an event because there's nobody listening for it, you don't have to deserialize the thing, and that decision can't be made inside that event listener thing, because by that point it doesn't want to deal with deserializing, so yeah, it knows.
No, you misunderstood me. Sorry. What I meant
Maybe I did.
that it should be the event notification service responsibility to enable and disable stuff on the store underneath.
Oh right,
not
yes,
that
okay.
runtime config. So all of a sudden you got rid of the necessity of requiring the store. Furthermore, if you look at that, the event notification service itself uses a reference to the cache that contains the store. So what I'm saying is that if you need to create a diagram of who depends on what, it's a mess.
Yeah.
So I think that can be cleared out pretty neatly. Now all of a sudden I think I just got given the contract and everything. It is obvious that there needs to be a single event notification service per cache, just because of the methods that are defined on it right now.
Right.
So that's kind of a good news. Or is this true? Wait a sec. This blah 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 cache event listener, event ordering, blah blah blah. On event, and cache event itself has the source, which the source is the cache. It doesn't need to. This is really confusing. Something's. All right, here's what I'm thinking. There are further cleanup tasks to your problem now, Rishabh, is what I'm getting at. I think what I would do is do what we just said, right? So the runtime configuration, have an internal runtime configuration interface, have our stuff implement that. I would go as far as do all the event registering stuff and everything. I would do the whole 9 yards. Right? It's a pretty isolated task. If you provide all the functionality inside this class today, right, it's going to be complete and it's going to avoid the temptation of someone implementing that elsewhere when the time comes, right? And I would make use of that for not for capacity constraints effectively, but for the resource pool sizing that we have on each cache.
Doesn't this go against what we were discussing, that we don't want configuration to act upon something? Like we just wanted to have the configuration and someone else just asks for it if it wants to do something, if we are registering the event listeners. So we are doing something with the configuration itself, right?
You lost me there. Sorry.
So the runtime configuration has registered register events, right?
Yes. Well, no, not the runtime configuration, the concrete type that implements runtime configuration. Because the concrete type that implements runtime configuration will also implement the internal runtime configuration type. And that's the one.
So we are letting that act on the configurations as well. Okay.
And for the event stuff, I would just do it one way so that you can get rid of it to the outside. I think fundamentally what needs to happen is have the cache event listener thing have a reference to that inside the runtime config so that you can add and remove listeners. But just do the minimal work to enable you to do the internal runtime config impl that we're talking about. To do that, and then when we clean up event notifications, we'll finish the proper concern injection with definition for each of the components. Because what I'm thinking is that it's maybe not useful that you clean this up today, because it needs to be cleaned up further anyways, and there is work ongoing now about this. So unlike this is just going to create more confusion, I think it's better if this happens like sequentially.
Yeah.
So Chris, are you done debugging your browser?
Yeah, sorry. No, I think you're. I think we're in a good place.
All right.
I do. We're not in the place that I wanted us to be in, but this is just as good. It's different, but I think it's
Well,
fine.
the good news is if we change our mind with the internal cache configuration, refactoring this to your proposal should be pretty straightforward. Because at least there's going to be proper separation of concern, and stop playing with your dashboard. I can see it.
It's really annoying. The stupid bug is annoying me.
Yeah. So anyways, all right, so that's good. Anything else, Rishabh, that you wanted to raise on this front, or do you think we got it all covered? And
just one clarification. So we are not going with the push or the polling. We are going with the poll, right?
we're going with the both.
So he's having regular methods for get this, so that you could do it that way. But he's also having the ability that you can register a listener on the runtime configuration and declare which properties, variables, whatever you want to call the config parameters if you like, you care about changes to. And you'll get called when those things change. Right. So a store might say, please tell me if the memory capacity changes.
Okay.
So effectively the big task becomes one, writing the internal runtime configuration impl that has all that stuff, and then using all that, then you need probably to refactor the events thing so that there is no more reference to out of this.
Yeah.
And then wire the stuff that most probably, given what we were discussing earlier, that you probably already did, which is enabling setting the size on the so that a user from the runtime config, like a user that says mycache.get runtime configuration, can do set
size.
Right, set size on some resource. Yes.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind that if the resource is off heap, this all should throw.
Yeah.
Preferably before we fire the events. No, well, maybe. Well, I'll let you figure it out. Be sure that if you fire events after the fact and a listener throws an exception, if it's to be considered vetoing, which is what Chris has proposed earlier on, you need to make sure that you didn't update the value inside the runtime config or that you set it back, right? So if somebody says, I want to change this to 2000, actually that's exactly what I mean. You probably want to set it back. That's probably the real proper behavior. In case, listen. Yeah, sorry, Chris?
Don't worry, keep going. I think that's a problem.
Actually, maybe what you want to make it, even it's only throw on a very particular exception that I would document.
Okay.
If the listener fires illegal argument exception or something, you roll back effectively.
Unsupported operation exception.
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Ludovic did not like the sound of that at all. So if you set it back, what happens if I call it twice? I have to lock, right?
If I set it back, I have to lock. I don't know. No, not
Well,
necessarily.
no, because I can't set it.
Well, as long as
Basically,
you're
then you're
applying
saying
to
those two
software
things have to be
ABA.
atomic,
No.
right? The firing of the listeners and the setting of the value. Otherwise, what do I set it back to? What if you try and mutate it and I say, well, I can't mutate it to that value, but concurrently somebody else tries to mutate it to a different value that you can mutate it to?
That's what I just said. For as long as you don't mind suffering from an ABA problem,
Okay.
you don't need to lock. You can just
You don't know.
implement all this with casing, and
Do you not mind about an ABA problem though?
I don't think you do. No, do you?
Well, yeah.
Because then
you
the
do.
other guy set it to the wrong. Then the guy set it to a wrong value too.
No, suppose the capacity is
42.
suppose capacity is 2 billion, right? And somebody comes through and says, I want to set it to 6 billion. And you go, I can't support that. I only support integers size capacities in this store.
Right.
And then concurrently somebody tries to set it to 1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
How do you need to provide some kind of transactionality, otherwise the one that's trying to roll it back, are you just going to try and...
Yeah, but you try to roll back
whatever, somebody else came around and that somebody's going to possibly do something, including possibly refill. I'm confused how it's a problem.
Yes, the rollback will fail because the original value was overwritten by a computer.
And then this other guy does something. I understand it needs careful coding, and if it needs to be done with locking, I don't even necessarily have an issue. I was just...
That's fine. Is it legal in the context of a listener to interrogate the config again? By the way.
Well, in the model that we discussed, yes. So this is why it's important.
That's why you want to do it. Okay.
Yeah, and this is why, and again, and on the firing, you also always want to support like old value, new value, anyways, right?
Yep.
So normally the context is self-sufficient.
By the way, how do we?
It's a fun
presumably. What do we want? How do we want to word the contract on changing the capacity of a store?
Can you elaborate on what question exactly you're asking?
If I shrink a store, what does the contract say? Because obviously it can't be. Will always be smaller than unless you want to force it to do it all in line.
No, but all right. So So it depends on the resource, obviously. But for heap, there is no way for you to provide a safe way to always say, I'll be below 20 elements. It's impossible. Well, it is possible, but it requires a small problem, right? There needs to be like a single serialization point, and you probably don't want that.
Nope.
So I guess that would be my take. Since you can't provide a guarantee anyways,
is it like eventually...
or you don't want to? Exactly. It's just exactly like
eventually consistent.
If you stop the world, blah blah blah, at some point it's going to settle to something.
Settle to being less than that size. Okay, cool. I suspected that's what we're going to end up with. I just wanted to.
I think it's a sensible thing to do in terms of performance, right?
Okay.
And if you really care about dropping the thing to something extreme, say in a clustered case and more advanced use case, this is what the maintenance mode is for. Yep. Right, and yeah, that's what you care about. But this seems like this is a very non-performant way of doing stuff, right? So I don't think that's what we should encourage. And anyways, in the case of simple caching heap, you cannot guarantee ever that it's not going to go above threshold ever, because it's going to go above threshold. All right, cool.
Yep.
Is that it then for that?
Apparently.
Right.
I think so.
Cool.
You surprised?
No, it's longer than what I expected. Disk store then?
Disk store.
Right. So that's the next bullet point on my list. So disk store. The problem being that I have a couple of issues with the disk store that we have right now in the 309, which is
only a couple.
What?
Only a couple issues?
Actually, yes, because you'll see at the high level at which I'm floating right now. actually really two problems. One, it stores the keys on heap. Two, it needs rewriting. So
Always needs rewriting.
So we want a better thing.
Mm-hmm.
And now, luckily enough, we have one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have something that is different.
Yes, it's different. It doesn't store the
Better
key
is
on heap.
Right.
I must say, I've never really looked at the implementation, but I can't believe it would be any worse than what's there is.
No, it's not.
It's not. But so
So maybe Chris,
Sure.
you should first explain what we're talking about.
yeah. So obviously we recently open sourced Off Heap Store. So to do a bit of sort of quick review of the history here and the archaeology of what's going on and why we're having this discussion. When Off Heap Store was first written in 2011, and when it was first released, one of the things we realized was that this opened up the possibility of having a three-tiered system in a standalone unclustered cache, and that was a disk tier, an off-heap tier, and then a heap tier. And you go, well, that's nice. You can store tons of stuff in the disk tier, and then like huge amounts of stuff in the disk tier, terabytes and terabytes and terabytes if you have the disk. Enormous amount of stuff in the off heap tier, as much as you've got RAM basically, and then the really important stuff in the heap tier, which is really low cost. The problem with this is that, as Alex pointed out, the as then disk store that was used in open source suffered from a major. Well, it wasn't a major flaw for what it was used for. The disk store that was in open source stored its keys on heap, and so what it was basically doing was what I've seen some other off-heap solutions do, which is to have a map from heap key to long, effectively, which is a pointer into some disk structure somewhere that you go read when you need it. But that doesn't work for us because at that point, that thing basically is limited to how much it can store by how much heap you've got. But we didn't want the disk store has to sit with off heap, so it'd be really bizarre if it was using heap resources and was limited by how much heap you had, because it could only store many keys. And if you reasonably sized, if you had large keys like strings and stuff, it might be a problem. So we wrote a disk store that basically could store its keys on the disk, and it's basically what it is. It's an off heap thing that uses a memory map file for the hash table, and it stores the values, the key value pairs, actual binary payloads, in a flat file, and just does that anyway. And so it has no heap overhead, effectively, or not a per key one. It has a small amount of heap overhead for keeping it up. And that worked fine. And of course, when we open sourced off heap, we also open sourced this thing. But now what we're faced with is we have two different open source disk stores with subtly different performance characteristics. And as Alex pointed out, most developers would probably make some kind of judgment about what kind of state those two things were in terms of the quality of the code. I will refrain in dissing this store because I was one of the people that was partly responsible for both of them. So
this is why
if one of them is significantly worse than the other, that's just something very weird about me as a person. Or rather, I think it actually says anyway.
So yeah, so obviously this comes at a downside, right? So I guess that's what Chris wanted to allude to. But there are certain operations that are just going to be much more costly. So anything like contains key, getting the list of keys, but lucky enough that doesn't exist anymore in Ehcache 3. Is there anything else? Getting the list of keys, that was the 2x.
Yes. I know. I get that misses. No, sorry, not I get that misses. If you have bad hash coding, I get that has hash code collisions. Full on, these have the same value hash code collisions because it will result in multiple deserializations. Because it'll basically reduce to a linked list search on the old style open source disk store. That would be a list search in heap. In the new one, it's a list search brute force on disk, so it's slower.
So again, all depending on how you tune your
quite
system.
a bit slower because it'd be disk seeking because they're not even stored sequentially.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah. Well, my take is it's probably worth it anyways. I don't. Like last point, you probably never want that
That's
anyway.
a bad thing anyway. Yeah, totally.
So, and you have all at your fingertips to fix it, at your keyboard as a user. So that's a good thing. The contains key, I don't.
It's not too important, in my opinion.
No, I don't think so neither. What do you do with the? To me, it would work if the contains key lets you do some kind of a state machine kind of thing where it's in the cache, it means something, but it's a cache. It's free to drop things on the floor as it sees fit. So how could contain key be used that way?
Well, so the one thing I would say about contains key is that contains key is probably going to be used in the style where you say, does it contain the key? If it doesn't, do something. Contains key that misses on the off-heap-based disk store is actually just as fast, assuming there's no hash collision, because it'll say that's not got a slot on the table, and the table is probably going to be cached in page cache, so it's just a RAM access. So it might be slightly slower because it's going, but not significantly.
It's going to be a context switch still.
Page cache shouldn't. It's memory mapped. It's mapped into my address, the address space of my process. It shouldn't be a switch to count. Yeah.
Okay, maybe.
It might be. It might. If you haven't hit the table in a while, it might force a context switch and the kernel to go read the page from disk for you and whack it in.
And again,
but I would have thought it should be mapped straight onto RAM inside your process. So I don't think it should. But anyway, either way, it's not like. I agree with Ludovic's point that I don't much care about contains key anyway. I was just pointing out that it's not that I think the common scenario would actually it's not as slow as you think either.
And beyond that, what I'm trying to get at is it's arguably you could argue that storing the key set on, which by the way you can still do yourself if you really care about that, and it works for you, which I still don't know how it would, but anyways, is the crap, what was I getting at? Yeah, you're using disk. You made the conscious decision that you'll be going to disk by introducing the disk.
Yep.
So, I mean, is it really that horrible?
No.
Yeah.
I don't think so.
You have to expect that sometimes you will get disk performance.
Right. That's effectively what you're asking for, right?
Yep.
And we know the other one's not going to scale, right? Given. And if you were using disk because of not wanting to have your heap grow to large usages, then good news for you. Just use the off heap. It's there.
There is. I'm trying to think of other differences because you're dramatic to it. The serialization. Some people consider this an advantage. I think should remember this. Serialization is done in line in the off-heap based one. The write is queued, but the serialization is in line. Whereas because what we queue is we queue binary write payloads.
Yeah, but that's I would consider.
Whereas the open source disk one, we queue heap things that get serialized by the
right, which then we need if the serialization fails, redrop, but pretend that we're evicted. And think
yes. Oh, there's worse things than that because there's a huge number. There's a whole bunch of issues on the forums and in Jira across years and years of people saying, I get this optional data exception from my thrown out of you when you're trying to serialize. And it's because they're using a hash map and they're mutating it while we're serializing it.
Yeah, but that will not go away, right? It reduces that risk.
It reduces
if the mutation happens on the stack, on your calling stack.
It makes it more obvious to figure out.
But for anybody that has the heap here, storing by reference, right? And getting a hit on it and mutating sequentially will just hit the exact same problem.
Yeah.
So
it makes it less likely, not impossible.
Right. It makes it
easier to troubleshoot. Because if you run into that problem and you get a thread dump at that exact same time, you will see that one thread is mutating the map while the other one is serializing it.
Oh, so you do today, right?
You get that now. It's just the threads are different.
Yeah. No, you see,
it'll happen less often.
Serializing the map.
It'll happen less often, at least.
Yeah, it. Probably, yeah, it eliminates the most.
But it's annoying every time it happens because you end up with an argument with the developer about, no, it's your code that's wrong. It's not us. It's your code. No, you've got a bug. No, and you end up with this, and eventually they figure out it's their code.
Right. So okay,
And
so that's
so far no one's sent me a beer every time I've had that argument.
7 minutes to go, but I guess what we have here is an agreement, right? We ditch the old one and we replace it with the new one.
What we have here is a rant about how crap the other one was, but
right, that's true.
But the end result is yes.
Honestly, if this needs to, if it turns out to be a bad decision for given use case and whatnot, one thing we can do is still move this like elsewhere. It's still gonna be in the Git history anyways, but right, and move it to something else or whatnot as an extension if you really want to use the old one. We could do that.
Well,
but
this reminds me.
I really don't see right now what problem it may be tackling. So I would just get rid of it, especially given the Montreal design, right? Overflows, not.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of do we want to that you could use it if you wanted as a test bed for pretending that some third party wrote a store implementation.
Okay.
You could make it an external module. You could. Okay. I'm not saying you have to, because I wonder, for example, the linked hash map stuff that you can still enable in 2x right now with a system property. Do we want to stick that as this external store module that you can enable if you use a custom provider?
We can think of that later.
I don't think we want to support that, but we might want to include that as an example on how to write a third-party store.
Yes,
I think that's what Chris was implying.
That's what I was saying.
Big bold letters, not supported for production usage.
Right, and I'm fine with that, and we could do that, but let's make that a post 3.0 GA release.
Oh, sure, yeah, no, totally.
Right. So,
yeah. But it would be a nice open source. Look, here's an example of how you could write it, and this is how you would configure it, and here's blah blah blah.
That's a very valid point. Or it's an evening project for someone. Be my guest. But if we need to schedule this, yeah.
It already is evening.
No, it shouldn't be scheduled right now. I think there's no way that it's way lower price than everything else. But
all right, cool. Again, agreed then. So I will know what further tasks to create. Okay, now what I would like to do with the last 5 minutes that we have is actually just here's my thinking with regards to release in the future. So what I would like us to finish is the couple of, well, the couple. The list that we're working on right now, everything that's prioritized, that has to do with cleaning different things up. I would like to finish this disk store port that we just talked about.
Right.
So right behind is about to be finished, and then I would like to do some stuff around the copy provider and avoiding dupe serialization across tiers, because when I said I would like to support this tier, I also mean the 2-tiered caching tier, a heap and off heap.
Right.
And that's what I would like to call a milestone 2. Which makes it lacking certain things in order to be a complete Ehcache 3, i.e. all the stuff around the statistics, the ARC, automatic resource control, that is, the transactional caches, properly finishing the resilience strategy, properly finishing the 107 hooks into our API. So what I mean by this is not 107 is complete, right? But make sure that you can like very neatly and transparently use the advanced features that we propose from the 107 API. And obviously I keep this for the end because that's actually the end of it all. There is one additional thing that's there that's making sure that OSGI is all working. But that's what I'm leaving out. So effectively what I'm proposing is to split add yet another milestone before doing the feature complete release of unclustered Ehcache, right? And after that, not that I want us to start on that after that, but I consider that to be released after that would be another milestone, which is declustered Ehcache again, based on the Terracotta 5.0 line. since we now also re-enable all of that in the open source world, you would get Ehcache, clustered Ehcache on top of the new platform sometime after that. So that's what I had in mind. If you have any random thoughts, share them. If you don't, it's fine. Think about it, and we probably can settle on that.
I think it makes sense. I'd like to. I know it's not in milestone 2,
Right.
but unless there's something really pressing in milestone that comes up for next meeting, I'd really like to see Arc the API on the agenda now, because I think it's really important we figure out whether we want to pull across the same stuff and what
and how and
niggles
and
we have about the way it behaves and how it's going to be implemented.
Yes. So as you know, I'm working on preparing a bunch of docs like these to be put on the wiki, and Arc is one very important one, and that I know we need to tackle rather soon than later. So yes, I am totally in agreement with you. As soon as we can, we should discuss.
But obviously, if there's really hypercritical stuff that's coming up in milestone 2 for next week, then we can preempt it.
Obviously, yeah. So
because we don't want to block people.
Certainly not. But yes, and worst case, if that happens, we can have some discussion on the mailing list, on the RSC channel, and then raise it next time with all, not starting it in this meeting, but so that maybe we have already an idea and we can. All right, good. Well, that's it then. Well, thanks for your time, guys, especially you, Rishabh, because I know it's getting late for you. And enjoy doing all this runtime stuff.
Get to bed. It's already tomorrow.
Get to bed first. Yeah. Sorry, it's tomorrow.
One polite thing. The thing that was discussed in the previous dev meeting about the naming, that has been done. So if you guys can just look at it and just.
Sure.
I'm talking about the cache joint listener. It's like I need that
I know
to go in before the runtime config. Yeah.
Right.
We're allowed to reviewing pull requests. Okay. Now that's aired in public.
Well, it was always. Just look at the
it was already. Yeah, you could see them sitting there, not getting reviewed.
And we fully acknowledge that. Yes, that shall happen.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, guys.
That's it.